The city woke before the sun. In Athens in the summer of 440 years before the Common Era, the first sounds were always the same. The roosters in the Kerameikos district, the potter's quarter in the northwest of the city, where the workshops lined the road that led out through the cemetery gate. The water carriers who started before dawn so they could be at the fountain house and back before the heat. The distant tap of a stonemason beginning work on the Acropolis hill before the full summer heat made midday labor impossible. And Demetria, who was 38 years old and who woke, as she always woke, to the sound of the first rooster and the smell of the city she had lived in for her entire life. Athens in 440 BCE smelled of olive oil and charcoal and fresh clay and donkey, and the particular sharp smell of a city of perhaps 80,000 people living in close proximity, without running water, without proper sanitation, without the infrastructure that we now consider the baseline of civilization. It smelled honestly like most ancient cities smelled. Not the clean marble fantasy of the history books, but the actual living, breathing smell of human habitation at scale, which is an odor that would probably knock you flat if you could step into it now. But Demetria did not notice the smell. She had been breathing it for 38 years. The smell of Athens was simply the smell of being alive, the smell of morning, the smell of the day's work beginning. She rose from the sleeping mat, the Kiln, the low wooden frame strung with leather cords across which the mattress lay, the mattress stuffed with wool and reeds and whatever else had been available when it was last repacked. And she dressed in the specific unhurried sequence of someone whose movements were so practiced as to require no thought at all. The chiton first, the large rectangle of woven linen folded and pinned at the shoulders, belted at the waist, the particular style of dress that every Greek woman wore, that had been worn by every Greek woman for hundreds of years, that would continue to be worn for centuries more, and that was, when you consider it practically, one of the most sensible garments ever devised for a Mediterranean climate. Cool in summer, adjustable, repairable, and entirely without the structural complexity that would consume so much of women's clothing in later centuries. She went to the kitchen. Welcome to Dull Tales. Hey there, and thank you for spending tonight with me. Tonight, we are quietly slipping back 2,500 years to a city that most of us think we know and almost none of us actually do. We are going to Athens, not the Athens of the philosophy textbooks. Not Plato's Academy, not Socrates in the Agora asking uncomfortable questions, not the marble and the columns and the pure white idealized beauty of the classical world, the way it looks in every museum in the world. The real Athens. The Athens that smelled of clay and olive oil and smoke and people. The Athens where the most celebrated democracy in the ancient world was run by men who owned other men as property. The Athens where women, even wealthy, educated, respected women, spent their adult lives in 2 or 3 rooms of their own houses, and considered this not a tragedy but simply the shape of things. The Athens where, on the hill above the city, right now, in the summer of 440 years before the Common Era, the most famous building in human history was being constructed stone by stone, and if you lived in the right part of the city, you could hear the chisels in the early morning. Stick around, because tonight you'll find out what Athenian democracy actually looked like from the inside, who it was for, who it wasn't for, and why the answer is considerably more complicated than your high school history class suggested. If this is the kind of thing you'd like to fall asleep to more often, there's a new story here every week, and subscribing is how you keep your place by the fire. No pressure. You're here to sleep, after all. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are, because somewhere out there it's always 3 in the morning. Somewhere out there it's always 3 in the morning. So go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe crack the window a little for that soft night air. Pull the blanket up to your chin and let yourself sink in. Let's pause for just a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be an ordinary person in ancient Athens, not Socrates, not Pericles, not the heroes of the textbook, but the potter on the street, the woman in the courtyard, the teenager about to be conscripted into military training. Have you ever wondered what the Agora, the famous marketplace and civic heart of the ancient world, actually looked like on a hot summer morning, and whether the people who invented democracy truly believed in it the same way we tell ourselves they did? Have you ever wondered what happened in the parts of Athens the history books leave out: the kitchens, the weaving rooms, the workshops where the actual economy of the ancient world was made, one clay pot at a time? And have you ever wondered what it was like to look up at the Acropolis every single morning of your life, knowing that the building going up on that hill was being paid for, at least in part, with money that belonged to everyone and was being spent by one man, without a vote, without a question? Then come along, because when you close your eyes and open them again, you're no longer here. You've just woken up in the year 440 before the Common Era. The city is waking around you. The roosters are going. And somewhere up on the hill, in the pale pre-dawn, a mason has just put his chisel to a piece of Pentelic marble, and the Parthenon is still being built. Athens in 440 BCE was, by almost any measure, the most interesting city on earth. This requires some unpacking, because the Athens of the popular imagination, the shining marble democracy of pure reason and civic virtue, and the Athens that actual people lived in were, in several important ways, quite different places. The city had a population of somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people within the city walls, with perhaps another 200,000 in the surrounding region of Attica. Of those numbers, and this is the fact that changes everything else, roughly 1 in 3 was a slave. Athens, the city that invented democracy, was a slave society. Not incidentally, not marginally, fundamentally. The leisure that allowed the citizens of Athens to participate in their famously direct democracy, the hours spent in the assembly, in the courts, in the agora debating and deciding, that leisure was purchased by the labor of enslaved people who worked in the silver mines at Laurion, in the workshops, in the fields, in every private household of any means. This is not a footnote to Athenian democracy. It is the economic foundation on which Athenian democracy rested. Then there is the question of who, precisely, the democracy was for. Athens at its height had perhaps 40 to 50,000 adult male citizens. These were the voters, the jurors, the assemblymen, the people for whom the entire system of Athenian democracy was designed and operated. Women, even Athenian-born women, daughters of citizens, were not citizens. Medics, the resident foreigners, many of whom had lived in Athens for generations, who paid taxes, who served in the military, who ran significant portions of the Athenian economy, were not citizens. Slaves were not citizens. So of the 100,000 or so people living in Athens, the famous democracy, the one that we in the modern world point to as the origin of our own systems, the one we teach in schools as the birth of Western civilization, was a functioning democracy for, at best, 40 to 50,000 adult men. Which is, before you conclude that this is entirely disqualifying, still a remarkably high proportion compared to every other political system in the ancient world. It was not a democracy the way we understand the word now, but it was something genuinely new, and it was functional, and it was, by the standards of its time, extraordinary. The year 440 is significant. Athens is at the peak of what historians call the Periclean age, the generation in which the statesman Pericles dominated Athenian political life, and in which the city used the wealth of its empire, the Delian League, the alliance of Greek city-states that Athens had gradually transformed into something very much like a protection racket, to fund the most ambitious building program in the ancient world. The Acropolis, the great limestone rock that rises 150 feet above the city, was being rebuilt. The Persians had sacked Athens 60 years earlier and burned what was there. Pericles decided to rebuild, not in the old style, but in something that had never existed before. A complex of temples and civic buildings in the finest Pentelic marble, executed with a technical and aesthetic refinement that has never quite been equaled in the 2,500 years since. The Parthenon, the great temple to Athena Parthenos, the virgin goddess of the city, had been under construction for about a decade and was approaching completion. The Propylaea, the monumental gateway, was under construction. Phidias, the greatest sculptor of the ancient world, was working. If you lived in Athens in 440 and you looked up the hill on a clear morning, and in Athens in summer, most mornings were clear, the sky an aggressive blue that the ancient Greeks apparently never quite had a word for, which is one of the stranger facts about the ancient world, you would have seen the cranes. The ancient Greeks used wooden cranes operated by human labor, and sometimes, by treadwheels, large wooden wheels that workers walked inside, like enormous hamster wheels, to lift the massive stone blocks into place. The cranes would have been visible against the sky, and the sound of the chisels would have carried down into the city on still mornings. The Athens you are waking up in is also, it is worth noting, about 20 years from catastrophe. The Peloponnesian War, the long, grinding conflict between Athens and Sparta and their respective allies that would ultimately break Athenian power and kill somewhere between a quarter and a third of the city's population, has not yet begun. The plague that would devastate Athens in 430, killing Pericles himself, among tens of thousands of others, is still in the future. You are in the golden moment, the hour before the storm. The city is wealthy. The democracy is functioning. The Parthenon is going up on the hill, and in the Kerameikos district, in a modest house behind a pottery workshop, Demetria is making the morning porridge. The Kerameikos district takes its name from the potters, keramos is clay, and from this word we get our own word ceramic, which is one of the more direct linguistic inheritances from ancient Athens that most people don't notice until someone points it out. The district was in the northwest of the city, outside the main city gate, and it was divided between the living and the dead. Inside the gate, the workshops and houses of the actual potters' community. Outside the gate, the great cemetery of Athens, one of the largest and most important burial grounds in the ancient world, where the Athenians buried their war dead and where the grave stelae, the marble relief sculptures marking individual graves, are some of the most quietly beautiful objects to survive from antiquity. The district smelled of clay and fire. It always smelled of clay and fire, and it was, in 440, home to some of the most skilled craftsmen in the ancient world. Athenian pottery was not just pottery. Athenian red figure and black figure pottery, the painted ceramic vessels with their scenes from mythology and daily life, their athletes and drinkers and gods and heroes, was the luxury export of the ancient Mediterranean economy. These pots were traded everywhere, to Etruria in Italy, to the Greek colonies of the Black Sea coast, to Egypt, to the furthest reaches of the Greek world and beyond. The potters of the Kerameikos were, in modern economic terms, operating in a global market. They were skilled workers in a high-demand industry at the height of their city's prosperity. They were also, almost none of them, wealthy in the way that the great merchants or landowners of Athens were wealthy. Skilled labor was valued, but the gap between skilled labor and capital was, as it tends to be, substantial. Nikodemos, who was 42 years old and had been a potter for 26 years, understood this gap with the precise knowledge of someone who had been living inside it for most of his adult life. The kitchen was the back room. In an Athenian house of the citizen class, not the wealthy, not the poor, but the comfortable middle ground of craftsmen and small merchants and minor landowners, the kitchen was typically the back room of the ground floor, near the courtyard, which was the organizing space of the entire house. The courtyard was small. Almost all Athenian urban courtyards were small. The city was dense, built to a logic of proximity rather than spaciousness, and the houses pressed against each other along the irregular narrow streets in the way of all ancient cities, which is to say, closely, economically, with very little of the personal space that modern Western people now consider a basic requirement of human dignity. The courtyard had a small altar to Hestia, the goddess of the hearth. It had a water storage jar, a pithos, that was refilled regularly from the public fountain. It had a large clay oven positioned outdoors, because cooking over an open fire in an enclosed space in an Athenian summer was a form of self-punishment that the Greeks had sensibly avoided. And it had a pomegranate tree, which Demetria's mother had planted when Demetria was a child, and which produced, every autumn, more pomegranates than the family could ever eat, and which was therefore the occasion for the preservation and the giving away and the trading that were the pomegranate's actual social function. The tree was old enough now that it gave shade by mid-morning. Demetria was grateful for this every single summer day of her life. She made the porridge. Athenaeus, the ancient writer whose Deipnosophistae, the dinner-table philosophers, preserves more information about actual ancient Greek eating habits than almost any other source, records dozens of varieties of porridge. Maza, the barley porridge that was the daily bread of the Greek working class. Wheat porridge, porridge with olive oil, porridge with honey, porridge with cheese. Demetria made maza. She had been making maza for 20 years. Her maza was, she knew, somewhat better than most people's maza, because she added a precise amount of olive oil at the moment of thickening, and she did not add it before, and because she used good water from the fountain on the better street, rather than the muddy water from the closer fountain that she used for washing. These distinctions mattered. When you eat the same food every day, the texture and flavor of that food matter enormously. She made it and she ate some of it herself, standing at the edge of the courtyard in the early morning, and she set the rest by the fire to keep warm for Nikodemos, who would be in the workshop by the time it was light enough to see the clay, and for Phocion, their son, who was 16 and who slept with the magnificent dedication of a 16-year-old boy and who would need to be called twice. She called him once to start with. The silence from his room was complete and confident. The house had 4 rooms on the ground floor. The kitchen courtyard area, the andron, the men's room, where male guests were received, where the symposion was held when they entertained, the storeroom, and the weaving room. Upstairs were the sleeping rooms, the main room for Demetria and Nikodemos, and the smaller room for Phocion, and a third room that had been the room of Demetria's mother when she was alive, and that was now used for storage, and for the larger loom that Demetria used for the heavier wool work. This is the layout that archaeology has recovered from dozens of excavated Athenian houses, a gender geography of domestic space, in which the ground floor was the public and working space, and the upper floor was the private family space, and the andron was the room whose layout and furnishings signaled the family's status to visitors. The andron of Nikodemos and Demetria had good clay-inlaid floors, a raised border around the edge of the room where the dining couches were placed, and a small mosaic panel near the door that Nikodemos had obtained in a trade with a mosaicist who had owed him a significant quantity of decorated amphorae. It was, by the standards of the Kerameikos, a respectable andron. It was, by the standards of the wealthy neighborhoods near the Agora, a modest one. These things are always relative. Outside, the street was waking. The Kerameikos in the morning had a specific pattern of activity. First, the water carriers who needed to be at the fountain house before the crowds. Then the workshop fires, lit before full light so the kilns would be at temperature by working time. Then the slaves, the workshop slaves of the potters and other craftsmen, moving between the workshops with materials, with tools, with the fired pieces from the previous day's work. Then the citizens themselves. The potters and craftsmen heading to their workshops, the older men heading to the Agora, the young men in the road doing the kind of loud, purposeless physical activity that young men in roads have done in every city in every century. Nikodemos had already been in the workshop for an hour. He was a master potter, a ceramius of the first rank, which meant that he designed and threw the forms while his workers, a combination of free hired men and slaves, prepared the clay, applied the painted decoration, managed the kiln, and handled the commercial side of the business. His workshop had 6 workers. Of the 6, 3 were enslaved. This is where the comfortable story of Golden Age Athens gets complicated. The 3 enslaved workers in Nikodemos' workshop were not unusual. Every workshop of any size in Athens used slave labor. The silver mines at Laurion, where the ore that funded Athenian prosperity was dug, used thousands of enslaved workers in conditions of brutality that the sources describe without particular discomfort, which is itself a marker of how completely the institution was normalized. In Athens, enslaved people worked as domestic servants, as craftsmen's assistants, as farm laborers, as public slaves of the city itself. The police force of Athens, the Scythian archers, were enslaved people, which is one of the stranger facts about Athenian civic organization. Enslaved people could, in some circumstances, earn money, accumulate savings, and eventually purchase their freedom. Some did. Many did not. The legal status of an enslaved person in Athens was that of property. They could be bought, sold, inherited, and punished at their owner's discretion, with legal protections that existed more in theory than in consistent practice. Nikodemos did not, as far as anyone could observe, treat his workshop slaves cruelly. He was what the ancient sources would have called a reasonable master, which is a phrase that carries inside it the whole moral weight of a civilization's failure to examine itself. A reasonable master. He fed them adequately. He did not beat them without cause. He had manumitted one man, given him his freedom, 3 years ago, after 15 years of work, because the man had become skilled enough that free employment was actually cheaper than the costs of maintaining him as property. The calculation had been economic. The man had gone to Corinth. Nikodemos did not know what had become of him after that. The clay arrived every morning from the clay beds north of the city, brought by donkey cart on a schedule that Nikodemos had maintained with the same clay merchant for 11 years. The quality of Athenian clay, the rich iron-bearing clay of Attica, was one of the reasons Athenian pottery was what it was. When fired, Attic clay produced the specific orange red that is the background of the classic Athenian red figure style. The black gloss, technically not a paint but a slip made of the same clay processed in a specific way, fired to the brilliant deep black that made Athenian pottery instantly identifiable across the entire Mediterranean world. Nobody outside Athens had quite cracked the formula. This was not an accident. It was the product of centuries of accumulated craft knowledge, passed from master to apprentice in the workshops of the Kerameikos. Nikodemos was currently working on a commission, a set of red figure craters, the large mixing bowls used for diluting wine with water at symposia, for a wealthy merchant who had specified scenes from the Trojan War on each piece. This was the kind of commission that paid well, and that required his personal attention on the drawing. The black figure groundwork could be delegated. The red figure drawing could not. He was good at figures. He had always been good at figures. The horses on his pieces had a specific quality of movement, the legs in the right relationship for the actual gait, the muscles of the flank in tension, that clients came back for specifically. Phocion came into the workshop at the 3rd hour. He had eaten his porridge with the particular haste of someone who has just been called a 2nd time, and does not want to be called a 3rd. He was tall for 16, taller than his father, which Nikodemos noted with a satisfaction that he expressed by saying nothing at all about it, and simply not complaining when Phocion took more porridge than strictly necessary. In 4 months, Phocion would begin his ephebeia, the 2-year military and civic training that every Athenian male citizen of means undertook at 18. He was not 18 yet, but he was close enough that the subject was present in the house in the specific way that near-future large events are present, never quite stated, always somewhat in the air. His job in the workshop at the moment was learning the throwing. He was not yet good at the throwing. Nikodemos did not tell him this. He showed him, day after day, the same adjustments. The pressure of the inside hand, the speed of the wheel, the moment at which the centering was complete, and you could begin to raise the walls. Phocion's walls were, consistently, slightly too thick at the base and too thin at the rim, which was the error of someone who was applying even pressure when uneven pressure was required. He was improving. It would take years. All the things that mattered took years. The Agora was a 20-minute walk from the Kerameikos. You went south on the Kerameikos road, through the Dipylon Gate, the main entrance to the city, the great double gate that was the starting point of the Panathenaic Way, the processional road that led up through the city to the Acropolis. And then you were inside the city proper, in the dense urban fabric of Athens. The streets were narrow. Almost all the streets in Athens were narrow. Only the Panathenaic Way itself had anything like real width, and even it was not wide by modern standards, perhaps 30 feet at most. The side streets were 5 or 6 feet across. Two people carrying loads could barely pass each other. The streets were also, depending on the time of day, wet in ways that were best not investigated, loud, crowded, and smelling of the full range of urban olfactory experience. But they were alive. Every business that an ancient city required was somewhere in those streets. The barber shops, where men gathered not only for haircuts, but for the kind of conversation that in the modern world happens on social media. The Athenian barber shop was the nexus of rumor and opinion and gossip and political commentary for the entire city. And Plutarch later noted that news spread through Athens faster than anywhere else in Greece because of the density and efficiency of the barber shop network. The cobblers, the fullers who cleaned cloth, the bread sellers with their stacked loaves in the morning, the fishmongers at the stone fish market near the Agora, the vegetable sellers and the herb sellers, and the sellers of the small clay figurines that served as cheap offerings at the dozens of shrines scattered through the city. A city of 80,000 people requires an enormous number of small transactions to keep itself alive, and Athens in 440 was a city in which those transactions were constantly happening, audibly, smellably, in the open air. Kallias reached the Agora at the second hour. He was 67 years old, which in Athens in 440 meant that he had been born around 507. He had been an infant when Athens was fighting for its democracy in the first years of the new constitutional system. He had been a child during the Persian Wars, not old enough to fight at Marathon, but old enough to have been evacuated from Athens before Xerxes' army arrived and burned the city, old enough to have watched from the island of Salamis as the sea battle that had saved Greece played out on the water below. He had fought at Plataea. He did not talk about Plataea. He had been a merchant for most of his working life, importing timber from Macedonia, which was one of Athens's most pressing strategic requirements, since the city and its fleet required enormous quantities of wood and Attica itself had been largely deforested. And he had done well enough that he no longer needed to work in any active sense, and could spend his mornings in the Agora in the pursuit of what the Greeks called eskol. Leisure, the time to think and talk and participate in civic life. From eskol we get, directly, our word school, the place where leisure is institutionalized. The Agora in the morning was the center of Athenian public life in a way that has no modern equivalent. It was a marketplace, yes. The stalls and shops and merchants were there, and most of what you needed for daily life could be found somewhere around the Agora. But it was also the civic center, the place where the institutions of Athenian democracy physically were. The Bouleuterion, where the Council of 500, the body that set the agenda for the assembly and handled the day-to-day administration of the city, met. The Tholos, the round building where the executive committee of the council ate and slept on rotation, so that there was always a functioning government present. The Stoa, the covered colonnaded walkways where people gathered to talk out of the sun, including the Stoa Poikou, the painted porch, decorated with great paintings depicting Athenian military victories, where philosophers would later gather to discuss the nature of the good, and from which the philosophical school of Stoicism would eventually take its name. The law courts, where Athenian citizens sat as jurors in cases that were decided not by judges, but by democratic vote of the jury, often in panels of hundreds. Kallias moved through all of this with the ease of someone for whom it was simply the morning. He knew everyone in the Agora who was worth knowing, and he was of an age where that network carried more weight than anything he could do actively. He stopped at the fish market first. This was a ritual, not because he needed fish. His household bought fish regularly through normal channels, but because the fish market at the Agora in the morning was where you found out what had happened while you were sleeping. The fishmongers had been at the harbor at Piraeus since before dawn, buying the catch as it came in from the boats. They had the news of the harbor, who had arrived, what ship had come in from where, what word had come with it. This morning the word was about Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. There was trouble. Kallias filed this away. He had seen enough of Athenian imperial politics to know that trouble in Mytilene was a phrase that could mean anything from a minor commercial dispute to the beginning of a sequence of events that would end with Athenian triremes blockading the harbor and the assembly debating whether to kill everyone on the island. He had lived through several of those sequences. He hoped this was the minor kind. Nikodemos came to the Agora at mid-morning. He left the workshop in the competent hands of his senior worker, a free Boeotian named Timon, who had been with him for 12 years and who was, Nikodemos had long accepted, a better manager of the kiln than he was himself. And he walked the 20 minutes to the Agora to meet the merchant who had commissioned the craters. The meeting took place in the Stoa near the Phocion, the temple of Hephaestos, the god of the forge and the craftsmen, which stood on a low hill on the western edge of the Agora and which was, as it happens, one of the best preserved temples in the entire Greek world. You can visit it today, standing almost complete, which is remarkable given that it is 2,500 years old. The merchant's name was Demetrios, and he was a prosperous man who had made his money in grain trading and who had recently developed an interest in fine pottery as a marker of his status, which was a predictable arc in the biography of the newly wealthy of any period. He wanted 12 craters. He wanted them with Trojan War scenes. He had opinions about which scenes. He communicated these opinions with the confidence of someone who did not know very much about the Trojan War but who knew what he liked and was paying enough money that his opinion would be respected. Nikodemos listened carefully. He noted the specific scenes requested: the judgment of Paris, Achilles dragging the body of Hector, the wooden horse. He noted which scenes were problematic. The judgment of Paris was a compositional nightmare on a rounded crater surface, and he said so diplomatically and suggested instead the Council of the Gods on Olympus, which was essentially the same story at a different moment and was considerably easier to render. The merchant agreed. Nikodemos had made this substitution in one form or another many times. It was one of the skills of the trade. The Agora around them during this conversation was a constant background of sound. The calls of vendors, the noise of the courts when a particularly dramatic testimony was happening and the jurors reacted, the conversation from the Stoa where a group of men were discussing something in the specific heated tone that Athenian democratic disagreement produced, the creak and knock of the market carts, the clop of the donkeys. Athens was not a quiet city. Athens was almost never a quiet city. The only quiet time in Athens was the deep of the night, after the gates were locked and the markets had closed, and even the taverns had let out their last customers, and the city breathed in the brief dark before the roosters began. Demetrios departed with his commission confirmed. Nikodemos stayed in the Stoa for a while, drinking the watered wine that the Stoa's attendant provided, and listening to the edges of the political conversation happening nearby. The conversation was about the tribute, the Delian League, the alliance of Greek city-states that had been formed after the Persian Wars to provide for the common defense, had by 440 become something quite different from what it had started as. The tribute that member states paid had begun as a military fund, a shared pool of resources for a common purpose. Over the course of 40 years under Athenian management, it had become something closer to an imperial revenue stream. The money flowed to Athens. The Athenians decided how it was spent, and a significant portion of it was currently being used to build the Parthenon and the other buildings on the Acropolis. The member states of the League had very little say in this. This was not a secret. It was a sore point. The conversation in the Stoa was about whether the tribute assessment for the coming year was fair, and the consensus was that it probably was not, and that several of the island states were going to complain about it, and that Athens was going to respond to the complaints in the specific way that powerful states respond to the complaints of less powerful ones. Nikodemos listened to this conversation with the half-attention of someone who is interested in politics, but who has enough sense to be mostly interested from a distance. He was a citizen. He could go to the assembly. He sometimes did go to the assembly. But the assembly met on the Phoenix Hill, a short walk from the Agora, and it met in the morning when the workshop needed him, and the sessions were long, and the men who dominated them were the men who had both the political ambition and the financial freedom to make political participation their primary occupation. Nikodemos had a workshop to run. He went to the assembly when the subject was significant: war, major financial decisions, things that would affect his business directly. He did not go to hear men debate the details of tribute assessment for Aegean island states. This made him, in the democratic theory of Athens, a somewhat imperfect citizen. It made him, in the democratic practice of Athens, a completely typical one. The workshop in the afternoon had a different quality than the workshop in the morning. In the morning it was preparation. The clay wedged and centered, the wheels cleaned, the kilns checked, the organization of the day's work laid out with the methodical precision that Nikodemos had developed over 2.5 decades of running a production operation with the margins of a skilled craftsman and the overhead of a slave-owning business. In the afternoon it was execution, the wheels turning, the clay rising, the painted figures taking shape on the vessels that had been thrown in the morning and were now leather-hard and ready for decoration. The sound of the afternoon workshop was the sound of the wheels, the low hum of the flywheel spinning on its pivot, which was a smooth stone set into a smooth stone socket and kept lubricated with olive oil, and the sound of the brushes on clay, which was almost no sound at all. Nikodemos painted the figures himself. This was not always how it worked in Athenian pottery workshops. Some masters designed and left the painting to specialists. There were painters who moved between workshops, selling their skill by the commission the way a freelance illustrator might move between publishers today. But Nikodemos had always painted his own. It was the part he was best at. It was, if he was honest with himself, the part that mattered to him. He was painting a Herakles today. The hero in the moment of the Nemean lion, the lion's head already pressed against his chest, the animal's legs splayed out uselessly against the grip of the man who was about to strangle it with his bare hands. Herakles was a popular subject. He had been painting variations of Herakles since he was a young man in his own master's workshop. He had, over 26 years, developed a Herakles that was immediately recognizable as his. The torso painted in a specific muscular shorthand, the lion's eye always open and always surprised, the composition tilted slightly so that the viewer's eye moved through the struggle in a single sweep. He would never know, could not know, that 3 of his Herakles compositions, on 3 separate black-figure amphorae, would be excavated 2,500 years later from an Etruscan tomb near Cerveteri, in Italy, and would be displayed in a museum in Rome, and that scholars would spend considerable effort debating whether they were the work of one artist or 2. He was a craftsman making a living. The scholars were a long way off. Phocion was at the small wheel in the corner. He had been throwing small pieces all afternoon, the practice vessels that would go into the kiln, not because they were saleable, but because the firing itself was part of the education, because you had to learn what happened to the clay in the fire and not just on the wheel. His current piece was a lekithos, the small oil flask, narrow-necked and elegant. That was one of the most common forms in Athenian pottery because it was used for everything from storing cosmetics to being placed in graves as an offering. It was, as lekithoi went, slightly wide in the body and slightly short in the neck. Nikodemos looked at it from across the workshop without being asked. He looked at it for a moment. He said nothing. This was, Phocion had learned, the assessment, the looking and the silence. If it was wrong enough to mention, his father would mention it. If it was wrong in the way that required only time and repetition to fix, his father would not mention it. The silence on this occasion meant, "You are closer than yesterday." This was enough. The ephebeia conversation happened that evening, not in the workshop but in the courtyard after dinner, when the heat had eased slightly, and the pomegranate tree was sending its shadow the long way across the paving stones toward the eastern wall. Nikodemos had, Demetria knew, been thinking about it for weeks. He had the particular quality of a man who had been rehearsing an argument that he did not expect to win, which was unusual because Nikodemos did not often argue about things he did not expect to win. The ephebeia was a 2-year program. The first year in the fortress garrison at Munichia on the Piraeus Peninsula, learning military skills and the formal obligations of citizenship. The second year patrolling the borders of Attica, the long months of walking the frontier roads that marked the edge of Athenian territory. It was mandatory in the sense that social pressure and citizenship expectation made it mandatory. It was not, in 440, legally required. It would become legally required in the next generation. For now it was the thing that every citizen father arranged for his citizen son, because the alternative was a son who was not fully a citizen in the ways that mattered. And in Athens in 440, being not fully a citizen in the ways that mattered was a disability that would follow you for the rest of your life. Phocion had no particular objection to going. He was 16 and he was healthy, and the idea of 2 years of physical training and frontier patrols and life among a cohort of young men, his own age contained, from the 16-year-old's perspective, considerably more appeal than it did anxiety. His mother had the anxiety. She managed it the way she managed most things, by not discussing it until discussion was necessary, and then discussing it calmly, and then returning to the things that needed doing. The things that needed doing were always there. The anxiety did not go anywhere, but it existed alongside the daily necessities rather than instead of them. On the hill above the city, the Parthenon was approaching its finished form. The construction had been underway since 447, 13 years now, and the main structure was nearly complete. The frieze, the carved band that ran around the entire exterior of the building, 424 feet of continuous sculptural narrative depicting the Panathenaic procession, the great festival of Athena at which every 4 years the goddess's statue was given a new robe, was in the final stages. Pheidias, the master sculptor, was overseeing. The pediment sculptures were being worked. The chryselephantine statue of Athena, the enormous cult image in the cella of the temple, 40 feet high, built over a wooden armature and covered with gold plate and carved ivory, the gold for the drapery alone weighing 44 talents, was complete. It had been dedicated in 438. You could see the cult image through the open east door of the temple on festival days. Even Demetria, who did not often go to the Acropolis, citizen women of the working class, went to the religious festivals when the festivals required it and otherwise stayed largely in their own neighborhoods, had been once with her mother, years ago, to see the statue. She remembered the gold. She remembered the scale. She remembered the particular quality of the enclosed space inside the temple, the way the light came in through the door and struck the gold and was multiplied into something that did not feel like the same light that was outside. She had thought, this is what they mean when they say divine, not that the God was present, but that the space had been designed to produce, in the human body standing inside it, the feeling that something larger than the human was nearby. The architects had understood this. The architects had understood most things. The Parthenon was not a simple building. Every horizontal surface in the Parthenon was curved. The stylobate, the platform on which it stood, rose 3.5 inches in the center, so that when you stood at a distance the building appeared to be perfectly flat, when in fact it was not perfectly flat at all. Every column leaned slightly inward. The columns tapered in a curve, not a straight taper but a gentle swelling and then narrowing, a technique called entasis, which prevented the optical illusion of concavity that a perfectly straight column produced when viewed against the sky. The entire building was a series of corrections for the errors of human perception. The Athenians had looked at what they wanted to see, worked out exactly how human eyes were tricked into seeing something slightly different, and built the corrections in. The result was a building that looked the way the building was supposed to look. This required doing the opposite of what looked obvious. This was, in some ways, a reasonable description of Athenian culture at its best. The workshops of the Kerameikos, looking up at the hill in the afternoon, could see the cranes against the sky. They had been seeing the cranes against the sky for 13 years. They would see them for another 7. By then the building would be complete, and the cranes would come down, and the hill would have its new face, and the city of Athens would have the monument by which it would be remembered forever, long after the empire had dissolved and the democracy had ended and the language had changed beyond recognition. They did not know this. They knew the cranes, they knew the sound of the chisels. They knew the occasional piece of white pentelic marble dust that settled on the city on days when the wind was from the south, the fine white powder of a building being made, drifting down over the streets and the courtyards and the workshops like a particularly industrious kind of snow. The other Athens was the one that Demetria knew, not the Athens of the Agora and the assembly and the Stoa and the court, the Athens of the Gynikon, the women's quarters and the fountain house and the weaving room and the courtyard, the Athens that was doing, every day, every hour of every day, the work that made all the other Athens possible. An Athenian household did not run itself. An Athenian household ran because of the woman who ran it. Demetria managed the household finances, the purchase of raw materials, the sale of surplus production, the accounts that she kept on wax tablets and in her head with a precision that would have surprised anyone who assumed, from the theoretical status of Athenian women, that such management was beyond them. It was not beyond them. It was something they were taught by their mothers and by the necessities of daily life, and it was something they did with the competence of people who understood that the household economy was their domain in the specific way that the workshop was Nikodemos's domain. She bought the wool. She arranged the grinding of the grain at the mill. The Kerameikos had 3 mills, one operated by a free Medic family, one by a wealthy Athenian who owned the machinery and hired the labor, and one by the temple of Hephaestos, which ground grain as a service to the district and used the income for temple maintenance. She managed the household slave, a woman named Mioto, who was perhaps 30 years old and who had been in the household since Demetria's mother had purchased her, and whose precise age and origin were not recorded anywhere that had survived or would survive, because the precise ages and origins of enslaved people in the ancient world were among the categories of information that the people who kept records did not consider worth keeping. Mioto fetched water and cleaned and helped with the weaving and cooked the simpler meals and did the dozens of small maintenance tasks that kept a household functioning, and she had been doing these things for at least 15 years, and she was, in the complicated and insufficient vocabulary of ancient slave-holding, one of the household, not a member of it, of it. The distinction is important, and the ancient world never quite resolved it to anyone's satisfaction, including one suspect's, Mioto's. The fountain house was 7 minutes from the house. Demetria went in the morning, as most women did. The fountain house was the social center of the neighborhood for citizen women, the place where the conversation happened, where information moved, where the network of mutual support and mutual knowledge that organized the women's Athens was maintained. You think of the Agora, you think of Athenian civic life. But the Agora was for men. The fountain house was, practically speaking, where the other half of the city's social life happened. The fountain, a stone basin fed by one of the branches of the Eridanos stream that had been channeled through the city's water system, was usually a rectangular roof structure with lion head spouts on the back wall and stone basins below. Women came with their hydria, the large 3-handled water jugs, one of the most common forms in Athenian pottery, produced by the thousands in workshops like Nikodemos's, and used every morning in exactly this way, and they filled them and they talked. The conversation was not trivial. Women who have been left out of the official channels of information develop their own channels of information, which tend to be more efficient and more accurate than the official channels, because they are not filtered through the agendas of the people running the official channels. The fountain house conversation in the morning covered who had had a baby and how it had gone, who was sick and what was being done about it, which of the street vendors was selling bad oil, what the price of wool had done in the last week, who among the husbands of the neighborhood had been seen somewhere unexpected, and what the current political situation meant for people who were not in the Agora every morning but who nonetheless lived in a city and had opinions about how it was being run. Demetria had strong opinions about how it was being run. She expressed them to Miato in the kitchen and to the women at the fountain house, and occasionally to Nikodemos when he had been at the assembly and had come home repeating the arguments of men whose positions she found unconvincing. Nikodemos did not ask her opinion. He reported what had been said. She offered her opinion anyway. This was their marriage in its political dimension. He participated in the democracy. She was not part of the democracy, and she understood the workings of the democracy better than most of the men who were part of it because she was not distracted by the performance of participating in it. He was not unaware of this. He did not say so out loud. Thea lived 3 streets from the fountain house and did not use the fountain house. She had her water delivered. This was one of the markers of her situation. She had the money to have water delivered, and she did not benefit from the fountain house in the way that citizen women did, because Thea was not a citizen woman. Thea was a hetaira. The word is usually translated as courtesan, which captures some of it and misses the rest. The hetairai of Athens were a category of woman that existed entirely outside the formal structures of Athenian female life. Neither the citizen wives who managed households, nor the enslaved women who worked in them, nor the porn. The women who sold sexual access cheaply from the small establishments near the Piraeus Road. The hetairai were educated. They were educated in ways that citizen women were not educated, which is to say, they could read and write and discuss philosophy and argue politics and converse with men on subjects that citizen women were theoretically not supposed to know about, let alone discuss. They could attend symposia, the men's drinking parties, to which no respectable citizen woman was ever invited, at which the actual intellectual and political culture of Athens was conducted. They had money of their own. They had, within Athens, a freedom of movement and public presence that citizen women simply did not have, precisely because they were outside the system of respectable female constraint. This freedom had a cost that was considerable, and that the ancient world did not record in the same detail that it recorded the freedom. Thea was 31 years old and had been in Athens for 9 years, arriving from Corinth where she had been born and educated, and where she had had a career until the career had offered her a better opportunity in the bigger city. She was, by the standards of her profession, successful. She had several men who visited her regularly and compensated her well, including one man who was attached to the Pericles circle, which meant that she was not entirely without political protection in a city where political protection mattered enormously. She kept the connection carefully. She did not rely on it entirely. She had her own money, in the form of a silver deposit with a metic money changer near the Agora, and she had it because she had watched what happened to hetairai who relied on a single man's goodwill without an independent reserve, and what happened was not comfortable. She read. This was considered unusual for a woman of any kind in Athens, and she did it openly, sitting by the window when the morning light was good, with the scroll from the bookseller near the Agora. There were several booksellers near the Agora, selling papyrus scrolls of the tragedies and the lyric poets and the early philosophers across her knees. She was reading Herodotus. Herodotus, the histories, the great account of the Persian Wars that had been written within living memory. Herodotus had finished it not 20 years before, and it was still new enough that people quoted it as current rather than classic. Thea had strong opinions about Herodotus. She had strong opinions about most things. She shared them with the men who visited her, and some of them, the ones who came to her partly because she was the only woman in their lives who would disagree with them out loud, valued this, and some of them found it disconcerting, and the ones who found it disconcerting she did not need to see again. She had enough clients. She could afford to keep only the ones she found interesting. This was a luxury that most women in Athens did not have, and that Thea understood to be a luxury, which was part of why she kept her silver deposit in good order. The silver deposit was the foundation of the luxury. Everything else rested on it. Demetria passed Thea's street on her way back from the fountain house. She had been passing it for years. She did not stop. They were not acquainted. This was not unusual. The worlds of citizen wives and hetaira in Athens did not overlap in the way of social equals. They overlapped in the way of people who live in the same city and have entirely different access to it, which is to say, they occupied the same streets without the streets being the same streets. But Demetria knew, in the way of neighborhoods, the broad outlines of who lived in that house and in what capacity, and she had opinions about it of the particular resigned kind that women of her class and position had about the presence of hetaira in their city. The opinions were complicated, because the simple indignation, the obvious expected disapproval, kept hitting something underneath it that was not indignation at all. What Thea had was freedom of a kind. Constrained, purchased at a cost that Demetria would not have wanted to pay, but freedom. The ability to walk in the street without male accompaniment. The ability to sit in a room with men who talked about the world and talk back. The ability to have a purse that was legally her own. Demetria had none of these things. She managed the household and she was skilled at it, and she did not consider her life a tragedy. She did not, because this would have required her to consider a different life possible, and she had not been raised with different lives as a reference point. But the question of what freedom might feel like was not entirely absent from her mind. She had carried it home from the fountain house one morning years ago like a stone in the water jar, and it had never quite dissolved. She came back through the courtyard gate. She set down the hydria. She started the bread. The day did not wait for questions about freedom. The day had its own requirements. She met them. The weaving room in the afternoon was the room that Demetria liked best. This surprised people when she said it, surprised the women at the fountain house, surprised Nikodemos, who expected the courtyard or the kitchen. But the weaving room had a quality that nowhere else in the house had. It was the room where the work was entirely hers, and it was also the room where, once the rhythm of the loom was established, her mind could go elsewhere. The loom was a large, upright, warp-weighted loom, the standard Greek type. A wooden frame against the wall, the warp threads hanging vertically with clay weights at the bottom to keep them taut, the shuttle passing the weft threads horizontally through the shed. The cloth she was working on was the border of a chiton, a repeating geometric pattern in deep red and black that she had been developing in her mind for several weeks before she began weaving it, working out the sequence of the heddle and the shuttle that would produce the effect she wanted. This was design, not art, in the sense that Nikodemos's painted figures were art, because nobody in Athens called it that. But design, the production of a visual pattern that required mathematical thinking and spatial reasoning, and a specific understanding of how thread behaved across a warp and what the eye saw, and what the hands did to make what the eye wanted. The cloth that Athenian women wove was part of the economy. The surplus was sold. The household looms of Athens were a production sector, unacknowledged in the civic accounts that recorded what men produced and traded, but present in the fabric of the city in the most literal possible sense. Every piece of clothing in Athens was made by someone. Almost all of it was made by women. This contribution was not discussed. This contribution was taken for granted so completely that the very invisibility of it was itself a kind of record of how thoroughly it had been naturalized. The way we take for granted the systems that make our own daily lives possible and notice them only when they are gone. Demetria wove. The shuttle passed. The pattern grew. Outside, from up the hill, came the faint sound of the chisels. The evening in Athens began at the moment the light changed. This is the light that every visitor to Greece in summer notices. The afternoon light has a quality, a thickness, a gold that deepens as the sun gets lower, and then at a certain moment the quality shifts from gold to something cooler and more final, the particular blue-silver of Mediterranean dusk, and the city changes with it. The vendors in the streets who had been calling all afternoon fell quiet. The stone that had been holding heat all day began slowly to let it go. The smell of the city changed. Less dust, more smoke, the charcoal and olive oil of 100 kitchens starting the evening meal. In the workshop, Nikodemos set down his brush. Timon, without being told, began banking the kiln fire for the night. The workshop day was over. Nikodemos went to the courtyard. He washed his hands at the basin, the particular scrubbing of a man who works with pigment and clay, and who has learned that you cannot get the color out from under the nails entirely, but that you can get it out from the joints and the palms, which is the version of clean that social life required. He sat in the courtyard in the cooling air, and Demetria brought him wine, the unfiltered wine from the large clay amphora in the storeroom, cut with water at the ratio of 1:2, which was how Athenians of moderate means drank wine in the evening, because drinking wine neat was considered something between impolite and barbaric, and because the water improved the flavor of wine that was not expensive enough to be drunk straight. They sat together for a while. This was the hour that Demetria valued. Not the conversation exactly, though the conversation sometimes happened, but the shared quiet of two people who had been working separately all day, and were now briefly in the same space before the evening's obligations began. The obligations were usually Nikodemos's. Men in Athens had evenings. Women in Athens had the next morning's preparation. The Symposion was the defining institution of Athenian male social life. The word means something like drinking together, and in its basic form that was what it was. A group of men reclining on couches around the walls of the andron, drinking wine mixed with water from the large crater in the center of the room, talking. But the Symposion was also the place where Athenian culture happened in the way that matters for a culture. The place where philosophy was discussed not in formal school settings, but in the informal, wine-lubricated, competitive conversation of men who were interested in ideas, and who competed with each other over them, the way they competed over everything. Plato's Symposion, the dialogue that gives us our own word symposium, is a record, or an imagined record, of one such evening, where the subject happened to be love and the conversation happened to include Socrates, who was extraordinarily inconvenient to argue with even after the fourth cup. The symposia that ordinary Athenians attended were not like Plato's Symposion. They were more often like any gathering of men who have finished the day's work and want to drink and talk and be in each other's company without the obligations of either work or family. Conversation that moved from the serious to the trivial and back, stories that grew better in the telling, opinions delivered with the confidence that wine lends to the delivery of opinions. Nikodemos attended a symposium that evening, not at his own house but at the house of a fellow potter, a man named Agathon, who was celebrating the sale of a particularly significant commission to a Sicilian merchant, which was the kind of event that warranted celebration. He walked the 5 minutes to Agathon's house in the warm evening dark, the streets still inhabited at this hour, the last of the daytime activity settling into the slower evening rhythm. The andron had 9 couches. There were 7 men. The slave girl who poured the wine was young, and moved through the room with the careful attention of someone who understood that the management of a symposium required both skill and a particular quality of self-effacement, and who had been trained in both. The wine was good. Agathon had spent money. The Sicilian sale had been a significant commission. The conversation moved, as conversations at symposia moved, through several registers. The pottery business, the commission, what Sicilians knew and didn't know about Greek pottery, less than they thought, in the general consensus of the room. The political situation, specifically the Mytilene problem, which had grown more specific since the morning's fish market rumors, and now appeared to be an actual factional dispute that Athens might have to manage. A long digression on the qualities of Chian wine versus Thasian wine that became somewhat heated, and then, in the later part of the evening, the Symposion's entertainment. The entertainment was a flute girl. Flute girls were hired for symposia to provide music, and sometimes other things, and the two purposes existed in an uncomfortable proximity that the Athenians of the classical period navigated with the flexibility of people who have decided not to examine certain arrangements too carefully. This particular flute girl played well. Nikodemos listened with the genuine pleasure of a man who liked music and had not heard enough of it recently. The conversation quieted while she played. This was the particular thing that music could do. Suspend the competition for a while, make the room something other than a debate, give 7 men in an andron a few minutes of something like shared feeling before the argument resumed. The argument resumed. It was about tragedy. Whether Sophocles was still the best tragedian working, or whether the younger generation, Euripides specifically, who was considered by some to be doing something dangerously new with the form, was worth taking seriously. Nikodemos had a position on this. He had opinions about the theater that he did not often get to discuss in the workshop, and the Symposion was where those opinions had their chance. He argued for Euripides. He was, in the room, a minority of 2. He lost the argument in the sense that the room did not change its mind. He enjoyed losing the argument more than he would have enjoyed winning it, which is the particular pleasure of a Symposion when it is working correctly. Kallias was not at Agathon's Symposion. He was at a different one, in the better neighborhood near the Agora, in the house of a man of old Athenian family who hosted symposia with a different tone, more formal, more consciously high-minded, the kind of evening where the entertainment was a philosopher rather than a flute girl, where the conversation was steered toward a question and stayed there. Tonight the question was whether virtue could be taught. Kallias had opinions about this too. He was 67 years old and he had spent those 67 years observing people, and his observation was that virtue could be encouraged and that virtue could be discouraged, but that the fundamental raw material of character was something you arrived with, and that education worked on what was there rather than creating what wasn't. He said this. The man across from him, who had been a student of some earlier philosopher, and who believed that virtue was entirely the product of correct education, disagreed. They went back and forth on this for an hour. Nobody won. This was, in Kallias's view, the correct outcome for a question of this type. Questions that could be resolved were resolved, and questions that could not be resolved were worth discussing indefinitely, because the discussion itself was the point. Plato's ghost would have approved. Plato was not yet born. The harbor at Piraeus, 6 miles from the city, was still active at this hour. The long harbor, the 3 harbors, actually. Kantharos, the main commercial harbor, Z and Munichia, the military harbors where the fleet wintered, was never entirely quiet at night. The triremes in the military harbor were maintained by the naval slaves, who worked through the hours that the free men rested. The commercial ships in Kantharos were being offloaded or loaded on whatever schedule the merchants had arranged. The taverns along the harbor road, the establishments that catered to sailors and merchants, and the particular floating population of the ancient Mediterranean trade network, were, at this hour, doing their best business. The harbor was where Athens met the world. Everywhere you went in the Mediterranean in 440, you found Athenian pottery, the red figure amphorae and craters and kylikes in the households of Etruscan aristocrats, in the graves of Scythian chiefs north of the Black Sea, in the storage rooms of Egyptian merchants. Athens was exporting its culture to the entire known world, packed in clay, with pictures of its gods and heroes on the outside. And the pictures kept coming. Nikodemos, walking home from Athens Symposion in the warm dark, a little wine-warmed and pleasantly tired, was walking through the city whose pictures he was sending to those graves and storerooms and households. He did not think about it in those terms. He thought about the Euripides argument, and about the Mytilene situation, and about whether Phocion's walls were going to improve by the end of the summer. He turned in through the courtyard gate. The pomegranate tree was a dark mass against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. The house was quiet. Demetria was asleep. He moved through the house with the practiced quiet of a man who had come home late enough to need to be quiet, and he lay down on the sleeping mat, and the house continued its quiet around him. On the hill above, the white marble of the Parthenon was visible even at night, pale against the sky, the cranes motionless. The chisels were silent. Everything was still. Athens slept. Not entirely. The city was too large to sleep entirely, and the harbor was still active, and somewhere in the potter's district a kiln that had been banked wrong was doing something the night shift would need to address, and somewhere in the better neighborhoods a symposion was still going. The conversation having reached that point in the evening where the arguments have collapsed into something more like monologue, each man conducting his argument with a slightly different version of the other men in the room. The wine doing what wine does to the precision of debate, but the city as a city was as quiet as it got. The gates were closed. The Scythian archers who formed the city's police were making their rounds, the actual police force of democratic Athens, consisting of enslaved people, which tells you something about the relationship between the ideals of Athenian democracy and its daily operational reality. The fountains ran quietly in the dark. The animals were still. The Acropolis stood on its hill, and the Parthenon in its present state of near completion stood on the Acropolis, and the cranes stood against the stars, and the city spread out below, 80,000 people breathing in their sleep, their daily labor and argument and commerce and politics suspended for the few hours between the last of the evening and the first of the roosters. Demetria would be up at the first rooster. This was not, as it happened, a tragedy. It was just the shape of a morning. Food in Athens in 440 was not what you imagine. The imagination tends toward the feast, the long tables, the roasted meats, the wine in abundance, the grapes and olives and golden light of a Mediterranean afternoon meal stretched out under the shade of a vine. This is the feast of the wealthy, and it existed, and it was real. It was not the food of most of Athens most of the time. The food of most of Athens most of the time was simpler, closer to the bone, organized around what was available and what was affordable, and what kept through the summer heat without spoiling in a city without refrigeration. Bread was the center. Not the light wheat bread of the feast, but the darker, heavier bread of daily necessity. Barley bread, mostly, because barley was cheaper than wheat and more reliably available, and because the Athenian stomach had been calibrated to it over generations. Barley bread and olive oil, dried figs, onions and garlic, lentils and chickpeas in season. Fish, always fish, because Athens was a coastal city and the sea was right there, and the price of fish moved with the catch and on good days was accessible to even the poorer citizens. Meat was expensive. This is worth saying plainly. Meat was expensive, and most Athenians ate it rarely, and the occasions on which meat was available to ordinary citizens were primarily the great religious festivals, when animals were sacrificed to the gods on a scale that provided meat to the entire citizen population. The sacrifice was the only occasion when the poor of Athens ate as well as the rich. This is one of the reasons the sacrificial festivals were genuinely popular and genuinely communal. They equalized, for an afternoon, the tables of a city where the tables were very far from equal the rest of the year. Demetria's household ate better than many. Nikodemos's workshop brought in a steady income, not lavish but reliable, and Demetria managed it well enough that the household ate fish twice a week from the Kerameikos fish cellar. The woman who set up her stall outside the Dipylon gate in the mornings with whatever she had brought from the overnight cart from Piraeus. And the bread was supplemented with olive oil that Demetria bought in the fall from the press of a cousin in the countryside of Attica. Filling the large storage amphory that stood in the corner of the storeroom and lasted through the winter. There was honey from the hives that the neighborhood association kept on a piece of ground near the cemetery. There was dried thyme and oregano, and the wild herbs of the Attic hillsides that dried on strings from the kitchen rafters. There was the watered wine. It was a kitchen that worked. It was not a kitchen that celebrated. Celebration was for the festivals, and the festivals came around reliably enough. The religious life of Athens was so woven into the fabric of daily life that it is difficult from the outside to see where religion ended and where ordinary existence began. Every morning in Demetria's household began with the small offering at the household altar, a piece of bread, a few drops of wine or water, a word addressed to Hestia and to the household ancestors. This was not especially pious behavior. This was baseline daily maintenance of the relationship with the divine, the equivalent of checking the fire and making sure the water jar was full. A practical task with spiritual content, performed because the household ran better when it was performed, and because the accumulated habit of the generations made its performance feel like the shape of the morning itself. The city outside the household had its own religious apparatus, and it was enormous. Athens in 440 had dozens of temples, hundreds of shrines, and a religious calendar of festivals that, if you counted the smaller ones, took up perhaps a third of the days of the year. The Panathenea, the great festival of Athena, held every 4 years in its full form and every year in its smaller form. The procession up the Acropolis, the presentation of the new robe to the goddess, the athletic and musical contests, the distribution of prize amphorae filled with olive oil from the sacred trees of Attica to the winners. The Dionysia, the spring festival of Dionysus, the procession, the sacrifice, and then 3 days of dramatic performances in the theater of Dionysus on the southern slope of the Acropolis, where the tragedies and comedies that would define Western literature were performed in competition before an audience of thousands. Demetria had been to the theater. The Dionysia was one of the occasions on which women attended public performances, seated separately from men, in the upper sections of the theater's stone seating. She had seen Sophocles. She had seen Aeschylus in the earlier years when Aeschylus was still alive and still producing. She had opinions about tragedy that she shared at the Fountain House, and that, she was fairly certain, were at least as well formed as the opinions Nikodemos had formed at his symposia. She had never had the opportunity to test this by discussing them with Nikodemos. He did not ask, and she had not yet decided to offer unprompted, because the unprompted offering of theater opinions was not quite within the established script of their evenings. She thought about doing it. She would do it, eventually. She was a patient woman. Kallias, on the morning after Agathon's Symposion, woke early and went to the sanctuary of Theseus. The Phocion, the temple of the hero Theseus, the mythological king of Athens who had unified Attica into the city-state that Athens now was, stood near the Agora. And Kallias went there most mornings, not because he was particularly religious, but because the walk and the brief pause before the sanctuary gave his mind the same quality that Demetria's weaving room gave her mind. A space in which the noise of the day had not yet started, in which the thoughts that were not thoughts about specific problems could move. He was thinking this morning about the question from the Symposion, whether virtue could be taught. His answer that the raw material of character arrived with you and that education worked on what was there, had been challenged overnight, as the wine wore off and the clarity came back, by the memory of men he had known who had been shaped by their circumstances into something quite different from what they might have been. He had been shaped. He knew this. The evacuation from Athens before the Persian sack, the decision to leave the city he had been born in, to trust the triremes, to watch from the sea as the smoke rose, had made him something. He was not sure, 40 years later, exactly what it had made him, only that it had made him, and that the man who watched the smoke from the sea was not the same man who had lived in the city before the smoke. Plataea had made him something else. He did not think about Plataea if he could avoid it. He thought about the sea and the smoke and the city that came back after, the city that rebuilt itself with a specific ferocity, the way a person who has lost everything and got it back knows the value of what they have in a way that people who have simply always had it do not know. Athens had that ferocity. Athens had rebuilt after the Persians burned it with the specific willfulness of a city that had decided to be more than it had been before, and the Parthenon on the hill was the most visible expression of that willfulness. It was impractical. It was also extraordinary. Both things were true. Kallias had been young enough when it was commissioned to be dazzled by it, and was now old enough to understand what it had cost and who had paid for it, and held both the dazzlement and the understanding simultaneously, as old men who have thought about things long enough tend to do. He sat by the sanctuary for a while. The morning was mild. The Agora below was beginning its noise. He would go down soon. He had nowhere specific to be. This was one of the gifts of his age. The pottery market had its own rhythms and its own politics. Nikodemos navigated them the way he navigated most things. Quietly, with attention, without excessive ambition, but without unnecessary self-limitation either. He sold to the local market, the shops near the Kerameikos that stocked everyday pottery for household use, and he sold to the merchant exporters who bought in bulk for the Mediterranean trade, and he sold to private clients like Demetrios, who wanted specific commissions. The three markets required three different approaches. The local market wanted reliable supply and fair price. The export merchants wanted volume and consistency, and they were the buyers who noticed when a workshop's quality dropped and stopped coming back. The private clients wanted to be treated as people of taste whose opinions mattered, which they did, up to the point at which their opinions conflicted with what was technically possible, at which point their opinions had to be managed diplomatically. Nikodemos was good at all three. The medics ran much of the export trade, which was a fact of Athenian economic life that the citizens accepted with varying degrees of grace. The medics had the harbor connections, the language skills for the foreign markets, the willingness to take the risks of long-distance sea transport that citizen merchants, who had more to lose in terms of status if a trading venture failed spectacularly, were sometimes unwilling to take. The arrangement worked well enough. The medics made money. The citizen craftsmen had buyers. Athens prospered. The arrangement was called by nobody a division of labor according to comparative advantage. It was called by the people who were less happy about it, the foreigners taking what belonged to Athenians. It was called both things at the same time, by different people in the same agora, which is how most successful arrangements work. Phocion, that same afternoon, had a lesson with the drawing. His father had decided, sometime in the last year, that Phocion should learn the red figure drawing. Not because he expected Phocion to become a painter. The expectation was that Phocion would either continue in the workshop, or if the ephebeia opened other opportunities, move in a different direction. The expectation was flexible, because Nikodemos understood that 16-year-olds had limited capacity to know what they wanted to do with their lives, and that the correct approach was to give them as many skills as possible and let the future decide which ones were useful. The drawing lesson that day was figures, the proportional system that Greek painters used to construct human bodies on clay surfaces. There was a specific formula, the height of the head as a unit of measurement, the torso this many heads tall, the legs this many heads long, the arm at full extension this many heads from shoulder to fingertip. That made it possible to produce well-proportioned figures without having to recalculate from scratch each time. Nikodemos had learned this formula from his master, who had learned it from his master, and the formula had been maintained through the workshops of the Kerameikos across generations, refined and passed on, the accumulated correction of people who had noticed that the calculation gave a result that was slightly wrong in this way or that way, and who had adjusted it accordingly. This is how traditions work. Not the invention of a single genius, but the cumulative adjustment of many careful practitioners, each one adding a correction that their successors receive as given. Phocion's first attempt at the formula produced a figure with arms that were slightly too long. He looked at it. He looked at his own arm. He looked at the figure. He made the calculation again, more carefully. The second attempt was better. The third was close. His father looked at the third attempt from across the workshop and said, "The wrist." Phocion looked at the wrist. He fixed the wrist. His father looked at it again and went back to his own work. This was the teaching, the specific identification of the specific error, delivered at the moment the student was capable of receiving it and nothing else. No praise, no extended explanation, just the wrist. Phocion did not find this insufficient. He was the son of a craftsman, and he understood that the criticism was the care, that the looking was the attention, that what his father didn't say about the second attempt was as important as what he said about the third. He had been learning to read his father's silences since he was small. By now he was fairly fluent in them. The medicine of Athens was, by modern standards, a complicated combination of the genuinely insightful and the completely wrong, practiced with equal confidence in both directions. Hippocrates of Kos, the physician who had established what would become the foundational texts of Western medicine, was alive in 440. He was perhaps 40 years old. His work on prognosis, on epidemics, on the importance of observation and case recording, had already begun to transform the practice of medicine in the Greek world. The Hippocratic corpus, the collection of texts that would be attributed to him and his school, established the principle that disease had natural causes rather than divine ones, that the body followed observable patterns, that the physician's job was to observe those patterns carefully and to understand what they predicted. This was, for the ancient world, a genuinely revolutionary idea. It did not mean that Athenian medicine was effective in the sense that modern medicine is effective. It meant that Athenian medicine was trying to be empirical, trying to base itself on observation rather than prayer, and that this effort was producing, slowly, a body of knowledge that was occasionally accurate and more often in the right direction. The physician who treated Nikodemos's persistent morning headaches, a result, most likely, of the lead compound in the black gloss pigment, which he handled daily without protection, the occupational hazard of the potter's trade that neither he nor anyone else would identify as such for another 2,000 years, recommended rest, dietary adjustment, and a specific herb preparation that probably did nothing medically but that tasted pleasant, and that the act of preparing and drinking was itself a form of brief pause in a working day that had very few pauses. The headaches were managed rather than cured. They had been managed for years. Nikodemos did not complain about them. There were worse things than headaches. He had seen some of them. He did not expect to be free of pain. He expected to work through pain, which is a different expectation and one that, in the Athens of 440, was so universal as to be unworthy of comment. The question of what Athens produced, what it exported to the world, beyond the clay pots that carried its painted stories to the graves of Etruria, is a question that can be answered in several ways. It produced democracy. The idea, at least, the first working experiment, the proof that government by the people was possible in the sense that it was possible, which is to say imperfect and limited and working better for some people than others, but nevertheless real in a way that no government had been real before. It produced tragedy, the art form that asks, systematically, why good people suffer and finds no satisfying answer and asks again. It produced philosophy, the methodical inquiry into why things are the way they are, conducted with the specifically Greek conviction that the world was understandable and that the human mind was capable of understanding it. It produced the architecture of the Acropolis, which was the physical statement of what a civilization thought it was. And it produced, in much larger quantities and to much wider distribution, the pottery, the clay pots with their painted stories. Nikodemos, sitting in the workshop in the late afternoon, putting the final details on the shoulder of the Herakles crater. The specific curl of the lion's mane, the particular weight of the hero's hand on the lion's neck, was, from the outside, a craftsman making a product. From the inside, he was doing what the painters of the Kerameikos had always done, telling the stories of the culture onto the surfaces of the objects the culture used, so that the stories went everywhere the objects went, so that the world that used these objects also held in its hands the stories of the people who had made them. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, something that mattered enormously, though the significance was not in the language of economics or political theory, but in something older and quieter than either. He set down his brush. The workshop was still. Outside, the light was going gold. The chisel sounds from the hill had stopped for the day. The Parthenon waited for tomorrow. The night deepened over the city. In the house in the Kerameikos, Demetria had done what she did every evening before sleep, gone through the household in her mind, the running account she kept of what was needed and what was present and what would need attention in the morning. The water jar, the grain, the oil level in the storage amphora, the wool on the loom, how much remained before she needed to buy more. The commission from the neighbor's wife for the new border pattern, which she had promised for the end of the month, and which was going to require 4 more evenings of steady work. The list was not burdensome. It was simply the architecture of daily life, the maintenance schedule of an Athenian household managed by someone who understood that the household ran well because someone was paying attention to it running well. Nikodemos did not know most of this list. Not because he was indifferent to it, but because it was Demetria's domain and she managed it, and the fact that it was managed was the result she produced, and the result was what he saw. The process was hers. She went through the list. She was satisfied. She let herself think for a few minutes before sleep about the theater. About the Euripides play she had seen the previous spring, the Medea, which had been, she searched for the right word, disturbing. Not pleasantly disturbing, not the disturbance of a good tragedy where you watched something inevitable happen and felt the pity and the fear that Aristotle, 2 generations hence, would try to codify into a theory. Something else. A disturbance at the level of premise. Medea was a foreign woman, a barbarian, who had used her power in ways that the Athenian audience was not comfortable with, and that the tragedy did not entirely condemn. Demetria had spent several mornings at the fountain house discussing this. The consensus was divided. Half the women thought Medea was monstrous and the play was a warning. Thought the play was asking a question that the Athenians did not particularly want asked. Demetria was in the second half. She fell asleep thinking about it. This was not unusual. She regularly fell asleep thinking about things. It was a form of freedom, the mind moving through the dark, unobserved and accountable to no one. The city continued. In the lower districts near the Piraeus road, the taverns were still going, the particular late-night commerce of harbor towns that never entirely ceased. In the Potter's district, the kiln that had been banked wrong was being carefully coaxed back toward the correct temperature by the slave on night watch, who was working with the specific competence of someone who knew what he was doing, and who had no one to report to, and who was exercising, in this small domain of technical knowledge, a kind of authority that his legal status in every other domain denied him. In the sanctuary of Athena on the Acropolis, the priestess was performing the private rituals that sustained the goddess's presence in the city, the rituals that happened at night in the inner sanctum, away from the public eye. And on the streets between all of these, the narrow streets, the 5-foot alleys, the occasional wider road, Athens at its quietest was still a city of 8,000 sounds layered under 8,000 silences, the breath of a living thing. Phocion, in his room, was asleep with the total unconsciousness of the very young. He was dreaming. The sources do not tell us what young Athenian men dreamed, but the sources on dreams in the ancient world are consistent about one thing. People dreamed about their preoccupations. If Phocion dreamed true to his preoccupations, he was dreaming about the throwing, or about the ephebeia, or about the girl he had noticed near the fountain house last week, and not yet managed to speak to, or some combination of all three. The throwing, the future, the girl, the preoccupations of 16 in any century. He slept. Outside his window, which faced the courtyard, the pomegranate tree was still. The air was warm and dry and carried the faint smell of the kiln, the charcoal and clay smell of the district, the smell he had been born into and that would, for the rest of his life wherever he went, carry inside it the word home. The commerce of Athens moved through the Agora in patterns that a modern economist would recognize and a modern consumer might find exhausting. There were no fixed prices. Everything was negotiated. The price of a fish in the morning was different from the price of the same fish at midday, because by midday the morning's catch was older, and the fishmonger who had not sold it had to calculate, reduce the price and sell it now, or hold the price and risk selling nothing and walking home with product that would not be edible by evening. The negotiation was fast, practiced, often contentious. Aristophanes, the comic playwright, had several jokes about fishmongers and their prices, which tells you that fishmongers and their prices were a sufficiently universal source of frustration to be funny to an audience of 8,000 Athenians. Some things do not change. We argue about the price of fish. We have argued about the price of fish for as long as there have been fish to argue about. The pottery market worked differently. Pottery was sold in advance of production on commission, the way Nikodemos worked with Demetrios, or it was sold in bulk to the export merchants, who came to the Kerameikos workshops and assessed quality and quoted bulk prices, and took away cartloads of ware wrapped in straw for the harbor. Or it was sold retail at the small shops near the Agora that stocked the everyday vessels, the plain black ware, the simple domestic forms, for households that needed a new water jar or a replacement storage pot. The retail side was handled by Timon, Nikodemos' senior worker, who had a gift for the commerce that Nikodemos lacked. Timon could tell within about 30 seconds of meeting a customer which grade of pottery they were looking for, what they were willing to pay for it, and whether they were the kind of customer who needed to feel they had got a good deal before they would complete a purchase. He adjusted accordingly. He had been adjusting accordingly for 12 years. He had, it must be said, made the workshop considerably more profitable than Nikodemos' own commercial instincts would have done, which was a fact that both men understood and that neither discussed directly, which is the ideal arrangement in a working relationship. The question of what Athenians actually thought about their city, whether the citizens of the most discussed democracy in history were as civic-minded and rationally deliberative as the political theory suggested, or whether they were, more often, tired people trying to get through the day, is one that the sources approach from interesting angles. Comedy helps. Aristophanes, writing his plays a generation after our story, gives us the Athenian citizen as he actually was, distracted by personal concerns, susceptible to rhetoric, tired of the war, interested in gossip, capable of both great public seriousness and magnificent personal pettiness. His citizens argue about whether to go to the assembly on mornings when the dew is particularly heavy, because the process of painting the Agora ropes red to drive laggard citizens up to the Phoenix Hill would leave a red stain on the hem of your cloak. They are bribed. They are manipulated. They sometimes vote on important matters with a directness and wisdom that shames the modern spectator. They are, in other words, people. The democracy worked not because it was staffed by idealists, but because it was staffed by people, with all that implies, and because the institutions were robust enough to function in the hands of people rather than requiring idealists. This is what makes it genuinely remarkable, not the theory. The robustness of the practice, the capacity to survive the people who operated it. Nikodemos, walking home from the Agora after his commercial meeting, was not thinking about the robustness of democratic institutions. He was thinking about the Crater Commission and the price of the Pentelic marble dust that had settled on his freshly fired pieces during a recent kiln opening, and whether Timon had managed to get it off without scratching the glaze. He was, in the best sense, a citizen, present, capable, occupied with the things that were his to be occupied with, available for the larger demands of the city when the city made them, and not particularly interested in performing civic virtue when no one was asking. This was democracy in practice. It was unglamorous and effective. The light in Athens in late afternoon in the summer was the light that painters have been trying to capture for 2,500 years. The specific quality of the Attic light, the clarity of it, the way it defined edges without harshness, the particular warm gold of the hour before evening, was not merely a tourist observation. It was a physical fact produced by the geography, the thin air of the Attic peninsula, the limestone hills that reflected rather than absorbed the light, the proximity of the sea that added a diffusing brightness to the atmosphere. The painters of the Kerameikos worked in this light. The sculptors on the Acropolis worked in it. And when you look at the figures on the surviving pottery, the specific way the red figure painters rendered volume with line, the confidence of the drawing, the economy of means that produced such completeness, you are seeing the product of working in that light. The eye trained in that light. The hand responding to what the eye trained in that light had learned to see. This is one of the ways that place shapes art, not through mysticism but through physics, the literal quality of the light that falls on the thing being made, training the eye of the maker over years and generations into a specific way of seeing. Nikodemos did not think about the light. He worked in it. He was the light, in the sense that he had been formed by it so completely that it was simply the condition of his seeing. The crater was nearly done. Herakles and the lion's eye open and surprised. Tomorrow he would finish the border. The signature of ancient Athens is not in the texts, which are extraordinary. It is not in the philosophy, which changed everything. It is not in the architecture, which is still standing. It is in the daily texture of a city that was, at its core, a city. The same negotiation of proximity and difference and necessity that every city has always required, conducted by people who woke up in the morning and ate their maza, and worried about their children and argued about their work and went to bed and did it again. The greatness was real. The ordinariness was real. The two things were not in opposition. The greatness grew from the ordinariness, in the way that all enduring things grow, from the daily labor of people who were doing what needed doing, in the light they had been given with the tools they had inherited toward a morning that was always going to come whether they were ready for it or not. The morning always came. Demetria was always up before it. The porridge was always made. The loom was always waiting. And on the hill, for 13 more years, the Parthenon was always going up, stone by stone, chisel by chisel, in the light that painters have been trying to capture ever since. The signature of ancient Athens is not only in the texts. It is in the fountain house where women gathered every morning and kept a city's information alive in the channels that official history never recorded. It is in the loom weights, the small clay discs, plain and purposeful, that archaeologists find by the hundreds on the floors of Athenian houses, testifying to the labor that filled the rooms where the weaving happened, the labor that clothed the people who built the democracy, the labor that is present in the object and absent from the account. It is in the pottery which went everywhere and carried on its surfaces the stories that the culture told about itself, the heroes and the gods and the athletes and the ordinary scenes of daily life, the woman at the fountain, the boy at the wheel, the old man in the Stoa, rendered in the confident line of a painter who had spent 20 years learning to see in the Attic light. History is not only what was written down, it is also what was made. And what was made in Athens in the summer of 440 years before the Common Era was, in several important and unself-conscious ways, some of the most enduring human work that has ever been produced, not because the people who made it knew it would endure, because they made it well. You are in your bed. And somewhere, 2,500 years ago, in a small house in the Kerameikos district of Athens, in the summer of the year 440 before the Common Era, the people we have spent this evening with are also in their beds. Demetria thinking about Medea, the question the play is asking, the question she does not have a word for yet, but that her mind turns over in the dark like a stone in her hands. Nikodemos, briefly awake, lying in the dark with the pleasant wine warmth fading and the Euripides argument in his head, and the crater commission on his mind, and the general low satisfaction of a man whose work is going well. Phocion, oblivious. Kallias awake longer than the others, the way old men who have seen too much stay awake a little longer, the night carrying more for them than for the young. He was thinking about Plataea. He did not want to be thinking about Plataea. He thought about the Parthenon instead. The building on the hill that had not existed when he was young, that was being built now, that would still be standing when everyone he knew was dead, and everyone who would remember knowing them was also dead. There was something in that which was not comfort exactly but was adjacent to it. He had helped to build what Athens was, not the Parthenon that was for younger men with steadier hands on higher scaffolding, but the conditions, the wars, the survival. The decision to come back to the burned city and rebuild it as something better than it had been. He had helped to make the world in which the Parthenon was possible. This was enough. He was tired. He slept. The Parthenon is still there. It has had a complex 2,500 years, used as a church, used as a mosque, blown up in 1687 when the Venetians bombarded an Ottoman munitions store that had been placed inside it, which is one of the more unfortunate episodes in the history of architecture. But it is still there, on the same hill, in the same city, in a form that is recognizably what Nikodemos saw going up when he looked south from the Kerameikos toward the Acropolis. The cranes are gone. The painted colors that covered every surface, the reds and blues and golds that the ancient Greeks applied to their marble, and that we have lost track of because the paint faded long before anyone thought to record it, are gone. The chryselephantine Athena inside is gone. The people are gone. But the geometry is the same geometry that the architects calculated, the specific curve of the stylobate that compensates for the eye's deception, the slight inward lean of the columns, the entasis. The corrections are still there, 2,500 years of correction for the errors of human perception. What we have of ancient Athens is not the city itself. It is what the city chose to preserve about itself. The temples, the laws, the plays, the philosophy, the pottery, especially the pottery, which survived because it was buried and because clay does not decay the way wood and cloth decay. The potters of the Kerameikos are better preserved than the philosophers in some ways. We have the faces of their heroes and gods on the vessels they made, and we can date the workshops within a generation, and we can sometimes identify individual painters by their style, the way a scholar might identify a medieval illuminator by the specific way they drew hands. Nikodemos is not identified. His Herakles is in museums. His name is lost. This is how most people are lost, not catastrophically, not with drama, but simply through the unplanned absence of someone writing down the name. He was real. He made things. They are still here. And Demetria is real, even if her name is one we have given her rather than recovered. The women of the Kerameikos left less written record than the men, because the system of record-keeping in Athens, the ostraca, the court documents, the public inscriptions, was oriented toward the activities of citizens, and citizen women appeared in the record primarily as someone's daughter or wife, named in the possessive. But they are in the archaeology, in the tools of weaving that come up from the ancient floor levels, in the household altars, in the organization of the rooms. They are in the pottery itself. The scenes on the hydria, the water jars, show women at the fountain house in exactly the postures of women filling water jars at a fountain house, which means someone observed this activity carefully enough to render it, which means it was a scene considered worth rendering, which means it was part of the city's sense of itself. She is there, in the archaeology of a room, in the water jar she filled every morning. In the loom weights that will outlast everything else in the house, the small clay discs that held the warp threads taut, which are found by the hundreds on the floors of the ancient houses and which testify, as silently as anything can testify to the work that was done there. The night in Athens in 440 is very long ago. The Parthenon on the hill is there still. The geometry is still true. The corrections for human error are still built in. And in the quiet of the Kerameikos, the pomegranate tree is dark against the sky, and the city breathes around it, and everything that will happen, the plague, the war, the trial of Socrates, the dissolution of the empire, is still in the future, still unreached. And for this one night, everything that can be is intact. Demetria is asleep. Phocion is dreaming. The wheel is still. The clay will be there in the morning. Spare a thought tonight for the people who carried the daily weight of the most celebrated civilization in the ancient world. The women who wove the cloth and fetched the water and kept the household alive. The craftsmen who sent their culture to the far edges of the world in clay. The old men who survived what they survived and came back to build something from it. They were not the heroes of the history books. They were the ground the history books stand on. They endured. They made things. And the things they made are still here, waiting to be held. You are warm. You are safe. The marble is cold and old and beautiful, and you are here in the present, which is the only place anyone has ever actually been. Sleep well. And that for tonight is Athens, the real one, the one below the marble, the one that smelled of clay and fire and morning and the small daily negotiations of a life lived under extraordinary circumstances with ordinary competence. Thank you for spending the night here with me. If this is the kind of story you want to come back to, there's a new one every week and the subscribe button will find you. Leave a comment, tell me where you are, tell me what time it is. Take care of yourselves. Good night.